The sound of silence in America's Corn Belt is deafening. Silos filled to the brim grain, ships stalled at the docks, and farmers staring at contracts that once felt unshakable, now torn apart overnight. For generations, the United States was known as the breadbasket of the world, a trusted supplier that could feed allies near and far. But today, one by one, nations are turning away, not because of price, not because of quality, but because of something more dangerous: uncertainty. From Cairo to Seoul, from Hanoi to Mexico City, global partners are choosing Canadian corn over American supplies. They are choosing stability technology and trust advantages America can no longer guarantee. Each cancellation tells the same story: food security cannot be built on shifting political sands. For the American farmer, this is more than lost sales. It's bread missing from family tables, livestock feed running dry, and small towns watching their lifeline vanish. And here is where Africa enters the picture. If countries as powerful as Egypt or South Korea are walking away from U.S. agriculture, how will nations in Africa secure their own food future? Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are already sounding the alarm. Food is not just an economic issue, it is national security. In Ouagadougou, the conversation is about sovereignty, about never allowing your daily bread to depend on the shifting moods of foreign capitals. So we must ask, if America is losing its role as the breadbasket of the world, who will fill the gap? Will Africa, under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, seize this moment to chart an independent path? Or will new alliances decide the future of food security for generations to come? Please share this video if you believe Africa's voice matters in this global debate. And subscribe if you believe that the truth about America's decline, about Africa's rise, is more important than the headlines. It began quietly with a single phone call in the middle of the night. Cairo, 3:00 a.m. An Egyptian grain buyer, his voice tight with exhaustion, canceled the largest corn contract his country had signed in 5 years. Not because the corn was poor, not because of cost, but because of something far more dangerous: uncertainty. For more than 30 years, Egypt had trusted the United States as its reliable source of grain. From Illinois to Iowa, American farmers fed millions of Egyptians, powering everything from livestock feed to the flatbread that sustains more than 100 million people. But when trade wars and midnight tweets began to upend entire markets overnight, Egyptian officials realized their lifeline was turning into a political football. Emergency meetings in Cairo grew routine. What if ships were delayed in mid-voyage? What if sanctions froze their supplies without warning? The breaking point came when a perfectly good shipment of American corn sat at port for 2 weeks, stalled by paperwork designed more for politics than safety. Bakeries in Cairo rationed flour, while grain rotted in storage. The answer came from the North Canada. Alberta and Manitoba didn't offer flashy promises, but something more valuable: boring, predictable reliability. Contracts locked in for 5 years. Deliveries on time. Quality exactly as promised. Within 18 months, Egypt had replaced $847 million in annual American contracts with Canadian ones. The message was unmistakable: we need food security, not political theater. Egypt was only the first crack. In South Korea, where technology drives every industry, buyers discovered that American suppliers were stuck in the 1990s. Paper records missing documentation, tracking systems that stopped at the U.S. border. A shipment sat at Busan port for 3 weeks while inspectors scrambled to verify its origin. Meanwhile, Canadian corn arriving the same day was processed within 48 hours, every kernel traceable to the field it was grown in. Korean factories couldn't afford idle production lines. Within 2 years, South Korea had shifted the majority of its imports to Canada, not because of politics, but because efficiency and transparency were non-negotiable. Then came Vietnam, where millions of small farmers depend on predictable feed costs for fish farms and rice fields in the Mekong Delta. Each time tensions rose between Washington and Beijing, prices spiked. Farmers paid the price, not politicians. Contracts became impossible to plan. That uncertainty eroded livelihoods across an entire nation. Canadian suppliers offered something: radical stability, predictable pricing contracts immune to Washington's political winds, and quality tailored to Vietnam's aquaculture industry. Within 3 years, Vietnam went from 78% dependent on U.S. corn to nearly 90% Canadian. The quiet pivot was total, and across the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia, food security is treated like oil security, a matter of national survival. For decades, American routes and banks controlled the flow of grain. But when shipments stalled due to political security screenings, Saudi officials realized diversification was an illusion. They turned north as well. Canada offered contracts free of American interference grain pre-cleaned for desert storage and documentation already tailored for Saudi regulations. Within 3 years, Canadian suppliers provided 2/3 of the kingdom's imports. Each case told the same story: America's greatest strength, its role as the breadbasket of the world, was being dismantled, not by war or famine, but by trust lost through unpredictability. Contracts once renewed automatically were now postponed indefinitely. Phone calls went unanswered. Silence replaced decades of partnership. And here, Africa was watching. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso studied these shifts with growing urgency. If Egypt could walk away after 30 years, what about smaller, more vulnerable African nations? For Traoré, the lesson was clear: never build your food supply on shifting political sands. Food sovereignty, he argues, is the bedrock of independence. Watching U.S. farmers lose their markets became a warning to Africa's young nations, a reminder that whoever controls your bread controls your destiny. From Cairo to Riyadh, from Seoul to the Mekong Delta, the story was the same: America was no longer the indispensable supplier. And as nations turned away, an unsettling truth emerged. This was not a series of isolated betrayals. It was the beginning of a global realignment in food security. The breaking point came not in Cairo or Seoul, but just across America's southern border. For more than 70 years, Mexico had been the most reliable customer of U.S. corn. The trade was so routine, it barely registered in diplomatic conversations. Mexican tortillas, livestock feed, and food processors depended on American supply as if it were family. But family requires trust, and trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. The fracture began with policy whiplash. Tariff threats appeared and disappeared depending on Washington's mood. NAFTA became USMCA almost overnight. Immigration disputes spilled into agriculture. What had once been stable became a political bargaining chip. The final blow came when a routine corn shipment was delayed for 3 weeks due to enhanced inspections. Tortilla factories ran dangerously low, livestock feed dwindled, and food prices spiked. Mexican consumers paid the price for American political theater. Then came silence. Instead of angry statements or formal protests, Mexican importers simply stopped renewing contracts. Canadian corn slipped in quietly through Pacific ports. Moisture content was calibrated perfectly for Mexican mills. Deliveries arrived on schedule. For Mexico, the betrayal was personal. Losing a trusted neighbor cut deeper than any lost contract. For America, it was a wound that bled credibility. But the blow from Mexico was only the beginning. In Tokyo, the world's most precision-driven economy food processors grew frustrated with inconsistent quality in American shipments. A 2% fluctuation in moisture content might sound small, but in Japan's tightly tuned factories, it disrupted entire production lines. Canadian suppliers, by contrast, delivered with exact specifications every time. Their logistics were so precise that Japanese companies could plan schedules down to the hour. Within a few years, Canada captured the majority of Japanese imports. American exporters were left wondering how they had become good enough suppliers in a country that demanded perfection. The crescendo arrived in Beijing. For decades, China was America's single largest customer, buying millions of tons of corn, wheat, and soybeans. But in a quiet meeting of China's Agricultural Development Committee, the truth became undeniable. Their food supply was dangerously vulnerable to Washington's political decisions. A single sanction or tariff could disrupt the diets of 1.4 billion people. That was unacceptable for a rising superpower. China turned north. Canadian grain came with something revolutionary: supply chains, independent of American banks, ports, and politics. Arctic routes bypassed U.S. infrastructure. Blockchain tracking guaranteed transparency. Within 3 years, Chinese contracts for American corn dropped by nearly 80%. Soybeans, once the backbone of U.S.-China trade, virtually disappeared. The pivot was not just commercial, it was strategic. By building food security partnerships with Canada, China reduced America's leverage in global politics. Reactions rippled worldwide. In European capitals, analysts spoke of a post-American food order. In Southeast Asia, governments began reviewing their dependence on U.S. grain. Canadian exports surged, backed by joint ventures, technology transfer, and partnerships that went beyond simple trade. For American farmers, the reaction was silence contracts, unrenewed phone calls, unanswered storage silos filling with unsold grain. But for global leaders, the message was loud and clear. Food security could no longer be entrusted to a supplier that treated grain like a political weapon. And in Africa, the lesson was not lost. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso watched closely. To them, the collapse of U.S. agricultural credibility was proof of a deeper truth: no nation should tie its survival to foreign powers who shift with every election cycle. When Egypt abandoned U.S. corn, when China cut its dependence, it confirmed what African reformers had long argued. True independence means controlling your own breadbasket. The high drama of Mexico's betrayal, Japan's rejection, and China's strategic pivot marked more than lost markets. It marked the end of an era where American farmers could assume the world would always buy. What followed was not just silence, but something more permanent, a generational turning point in global food security. The consequences of this global shift are not measured only in trade balances or export charts. They are written in the quiet despair of small-town America. Drive through the Corn Belt today, and you will see silos filled with grain that nobody wants to buy. Trucks idle on dusty roads. Families count the days until the bank calls in loans. In communities where agriculture is the lifeline, every canceled contract is more than a statistic. It is a child's college tuition, a family home at risk, a tradition of farming passed from father to son now hanging by a thread. For farmers, the collapse of trust abroad means bankruptcy at home. Entire towns that once thrived on exports now face shuttered businesses, schools losing students, and churches with dwindling congregations. What was once a proud role feeding the world has turned into a question of survival. If our own government treats food like a political weapon, one farmer might ask, why should anyone else trust us? The ripple effects extend far beyond rural America. Politically, the United States has lost a key tool of soft power. For decades, grain was more than food, it was diplomacy. U.S. corn and wheat fed allies, stabilized economies, and built goodwill. Now that leverage is slipping away. Nations that once depended on Washington's generosity are rewriting their supply chains without America in the picture. The old truth that you can't go to war with the country that feeds you is fading. Economically, billions of dollars vanish with every lost contract. American exports to China alone once represented lifelines for entire farming states. Today, those markets are gone. Without global demand, prices fall. Government subsidies may ease the pain temporarily, but they cannot replace decades of trust lost in a few short years. Generational farms are closing. Young people look elsewhere for work. The very identity of the American heartland is eroding. And the world is watching. If the United States cannot guarantee stability in something as fundamental as food, can it still claim leadership in other areas of global security? Rivals seize on the vacuum. Canada steps forward with reliability. China couples agricultural deals with strategic influence. Russia and Brazil look for openings. What America loses is not just money, but credibility. In Africa, the consequences resonate even louder. For decades, many African nations were told their food security depended on Western suppliers. But watching Egypt, Mexico, and even China walk away has sparked new debates. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso argue that Africa cannot afford to rely on powers that treat grain as a bargaining chip. In Ouagadougou, the message is blunt. If they can betray their closest partners, what chance do we have? For Traoré, America's agricultural unraveling is more than a cautionary tale. It is a call to action. Burkina Faso, like much of Africa, faces the twin challenges of feeding a young population and resisting external pressure. To him, food is not simply about nutrition, it is sovereignty. And as American farmers watch their crops rot in silos, African leaders see both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is that dependence can be deadly. The opportunity is that in a post-American food order, Africa may finally claim its own destiny. The civil and political consequences of America's agricultural decline are inseparable. Lost sales mean lost influence. Lost trust means lost power. And in an age when bread is as vital as bullets, the United States is learning that food security is not just about feeding people, it is about securing nations. From Washington's perspective, the unraveling of American agriculture is still explained in technical terms: tariffs, logistics, temporary market fluctuations. Officials insist these are challenges that can be corrected with new trade deals or subsidies. But for the world watching, the issue is far deeper. What disappeared was not just market share, but something more fragile: trust. For many Americans, especially those in rural communities, the question is personal. How did we go from being the breadbasket of the world to watching Canada feed our allies? To them, the story is not about distant geopolitics, but about identity. Farming was not only an economic role, it was a symbol of American reliability. Losing that role feels like losing a piece of the nation's soul. And for older generations, the ones who remember America feeding post-war Europe or stabilizing markets during crises, the decline is more than economic. It feels like betrayal, both by foreign partners and by their own leaders who turned grain into a political weapon. The world, however, sees opportunity in America's stumble. In Tokyo, Ottawa, and Beijing, analysts describe a post-American food order where stability and predictability matter more than history. Nations are not waiting for the United States to regain its footing. They are building entirely new systems of supply that no longer depend on Washington. The shift is structural, not temporary. And in Africa, the message resonates most strongly. For decades, African nations were taught to depend on Western suppliers. Yet, the collapse of U.S. credibility shows how dangerous dependence can be. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso interpret the American decline as proof that food sovereignty is essential. To him and to many across the continent, agriculture is no longer a background issue, it is national defense. If America can lose markets after a single election cycle, why should African nations believe their bread and rice will always arrive when needed? This is why conversations in Ouagadougou, Accra, and Nairobi increasingly echo a common theme: Africa must feed itself. The fall of U.S. dominance creates space for new partnerships, but also strengthens the argument for regional self-reliance. For older Americans watching from afar, the parallel is striking. Just as they worry about whether the United States can still be trusted abroad, Africans ask whether they can ever afford to trust outside powers at all. The American perspective clings to hope of recovery. The global perspective has already moved on. And Africa's perspective, embodied in Traoré's speeches and reforms, may be the most radical of all. In a world where food is power, only sovereignty guarantees survival. The story of American agriculture's decline is not just about lost markets. It is about something much deeper: the unraveling of a promise. For generations, the world believed that when food came from America, it came with stability. That promise is broken. And once trust is gone, it rarely returns. The warning is clear: when a nation loses its role as the world's breadbasket, it loses more than sales. It loses influence, credibility, and a piece of its identity. In a world where food security is as important as energy security, that loss is a national vulnerability. History reminds us that wars have been fought not only over oil or territory, but over bread. If America no longer holds that position of reliability, who will step in to shape the future of global food security? Some see Canada rising to fill the gap. Others point to China's sweeping strategy of pairing grain with infrastructure and influence. But perhaps the most surprising shift is in Africa, where leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are turning this global disruption into a rallying cry. To Traoré, the collapse of American dominance is proof that true independence begins at the dinner table. If powerful nations can lose markets overnight, then African nations must learn to grow, store, and distribute their own food, or risk becoming permanent hostages to foreign politics. For older Americans watching this unfold, the question cuts both ways. Can the United States rebuild the trust it once held, or has the world already moved on? And in Africa, can young reformers like Ibrahim Traoré really transform food sovereignty from an aspiration into reality? These are not abstract questions. They will shape the next generation. Bread, rice, and corn are not just commodities. They are the foundation of families, of communities, of nations. And the choices made today will decide whether the future belongs to stability or to uncertainty. So I leave you with this. Do you believe America can still reclaim its place in the global food chain? Or do you think Africa, through leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, will be the one to redefine food security for the 21st century? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for Africa. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in the end, food is not just about survival. It is about sovereignty, and sovereignty decides the future.